Do any of the remembering today.
No white person are going to brainwash me.
This gallery is in itself a work of art.
I'm surprised at how many people have a car. They won't let their wives drive it.
I sort of realised there aren't any people of colour in those departments.
Women in Australia retire with 35% less super than men, and we're sick of it. The system was never built for us, so Verve Super was. Verve was founded by women to support women to build wealth and invest in a better world, while we all work together for change, because super is power, and women deserve more of both. Verve, proud partner of All About Women 2021.
Warami, Walama Bamai, Jubagali, Nora Gadigal Mujin, Gurgawiri Galgala Gui, Yaguna, Bariala, Banga Bujari Gunyalum Yalum.
The Sydney Opera House acknowledges the lands of the Gadigal, and we welcome you to Jubagali, now known as Bennelong Point. The Sydney Opera House honours our First Nations by fostering a shared sense of belonging for all Australians. And we pay our deep respects to the Gadigal people, traditional custodians of Jubagali. Welcome to the Sydney Opera House and enjoy the show.
Hi, everybody. Hello, welcome to this sold-out session of the All About Women Festival. I know it doesn't look sold out, but this is COVID sold out, so congratulations on getting a ticket. And can we have a big warm welcome to our speakers today? Away from me, Jules Kim is a Korean Australian, the CEO of Scarlet Alliance Australian Sex Workers Association, which is the peak national organisation that's been representing sex workers and sex worker organisation. And she has been a sex worker and sex worker activist for over 20 years. Jules! In the middle, Tilly Lawless is a queer Sydney-based sex worker who is passionate about horses, sex worker rights and feminism. She uses Instagram to speak about personal experiences within the sex industry, which you can follow, Tilly_Lawless, and her debut novel, Nothing But My Body, is being released by Allen and Unwin in June. Tilly Lawless! Nearest to me is Chantel Martin, a trans sex worker who works at the Transgender Outreach Officer as the Transgender Outreach Officer at SWAP. And she's what we're calling the grandma on the panel and one of the founding members of the only transgender housing cooperative in New South Wales. So today... And I'm Yumi. Thanks for joining us today. Today we're here to talk about the fraught relationship between sex workers and feminism. And what a great place to do it here at the Sydney Opera House, because it's such a mainstream arts organisation where we can work out how feminism fails the sex industry. Jules, can I put that question to you? How does feminism fail the sex industry?
Look, I think there's some really narrow conceptions of feminisms. I'm a sex worker and I consider myself a feminist. And I think, you know, as a feminist, I respect other women's choice, all women in all their diversity, to choose how they work and to exercise their bodily autonomy. And regardless of whether you're a white woman or a woman of colour or a migrant woman, I think we need to be able to respect the choices of other women and their ability to speak for themselves. And I think that that's where there's a bit of a divide, where there's this conception that if you're a sex worker, then, you know, you must be exploited. If you're a migrant sex worker, you must be trafficked. And this is not the reality for most sex workers. And the problem with this conception is that when we do experience exploitation and we do experience violence, as women do in other professions, it makes it really difficult for us to seek redress because all our work is being conceived in that way. And just because we've chosen to be sex workers doesn't mean we're consenting to violence. It means we've chosen to work. You know, and that shouldn't be a barrier to us accessing justice if we need to.
Tilly, can I put it to you? Is one of the reasons feminism fails the sex industry because of white saviorism, where people want to kind of swoop in and rescue the sex worker?
Oh, well, yeah, that's obviously an issue because people are hyper-focused on migrant sex workers who generally aren't white, rather than, like, for example, a sex worker like me who's, like, you know, been to university and is white, and people assume I can make, you know, an empowered decision based on choice and, like, other women can't. But I think it's also tied into kind of second-wave feminism of thinking you need to be a certain kind of woman to be a feminist, and, like, anything that is seen as, like, catering to the patriarchy is somehow like betraying your kind and like betraying the movement forward of feminism. And I think like a lot of people are threatened by sex workers because we employ things like hyper-femininity to like make money. You know, like we often maybe access plastic surgery. Also, there's like a huge crossover between trans women and sex work, and like a lot of second wave feminists don't believe trans women are women. So like that is something that's also threatening about it. And I think also the fact that like sex work is something that often like middle class women and migrant women and black women and queer women and stuff use to climb the social ladder and like achieve financial stability is something that's really threatening to people. Yeah, because it just like sort of upsets that like hierarchy that we're meant to exist within. Yeah.
Chantel, can I put it to you how feminism has failed you in your experience of the sex industry?
Yeah, sure. Sort of like, well, as a trans woman and a past sex worker, you know, feminism has kind of not been gentle with trans women, full stop. A lot of feminists see us as men or as men who are trying to steal feminist identities, which is so not true, you know, so not true. And so when they see us in the sex industry, it's kind of like, okay, so you must be oppressed then, you know? And it's not like that at all, totally not like that at all. I mean, as a sex worker, I enjoyed what I did. I loved what I did, you know, and it was my choice. It was my body. And yeah.
I want to talk about oppression and sex work, but I just wanted to tell the audience that if you've got a question for our panel, you're actually very welcome to ask a question. We're using Slido to collect anything that you want to ask for the Q&A portion of this talk. So if you're here in the venue or if you're watching from home, just open any browser that you use, go to sli.do and type in the event code All About Women, select the venue. So this is the Drama Theatre, and you'll be directed to the questions submission page. You can do it from here, you can do it from home, and you can also look at other questions others have asked and vote for them to be asked more, to be more likely to be asked. Sli.do, sli.do. Chantel, back to you. Let's talk about how the effect of the intersection of culture, so you're an Indigenous New Zealander, being a person of colour, street-based sex work has exacerbated the discrimination that you've experienced.
Yeah, so, and I guess to share this story, it's really like coming from New Zealand, okay, and being a trans woman of colour and working in the industry, what I witnessed as a trans sex worker was the slight differences in discrimination and stigma, especially towards my other sisters here in Australia, the sister girls, and that, you know, where I was seen as okay, but my sister girls weren't, and so they experienced so much more discrimination and stigma than I did. And for me, that was really sad. It was really saddening to see that happen and experience that on the street. I mean, an example was where one night I asked the sister to actually flag a taxi down, and she said, "Oh, they won't stop for me," you know. And I said, "Yeah, they will. Stop trying to get out of it," you know. And she said, "I'm telling you, sis, they're not." And I said, "Stand up and get a taxi." So I stood there, she stood up to flag the taxi down. It was coming out of the cross, it pulled over, and as soon as it saw her, it pulled away.
Took off.
And she goes, "See, I told you." And I said to her, "Just keep trying," because I didn't believe her. And then another 2 taxis came along, waited till she touched the door handle, and when she pulled the door open, it drove off. And that was unbelievable. So I went and stood out there, and 3 taxis pulled over. And yeah, and that is, yes, so that's the experience I've had.
Tilly, you're about to go to a Mardi Gras party right after this panel.
Yeah. That's why I'm dressed like this at the Opera House.
Some of us are going to see other talks, but you're off to a party. Just speaking of Mardi Gras, queer rights intersecting with sex worker rights, how do those two overlap?
Yeah, well, obviously, historically, like, I know, like, queer people are so much more accepted now than they used to be, but, like, historically, queer people were often shut out of normal jobs, and so sex work was a way queer people could access financial stability and also often didn't have to be hired in, like, the normal way. And it still is an industry that a lot of queer people enter, especially, like, black trans women, but also it also, in the queer community, generally, like, you see a lot more of acceptance of sex work than you see in the straight community. You know, like, for example, like, mixing with my gay guy friends, like, none of them have ever questioned me doing sex work. And, like, a lot of them have actually often informally kind of worked in sex work, you know, like a little bit of like a paid grind a date here and there. So it's kind of something that a lot of queer people have like dabbled in. And for me, the two are just, you know, like obviously now we see with like homonormativity, you know, where like queer people are trying to prove that we are valuable because like we're respectable people, you know, like we say like, oh, you know, I'm going to get married and I'm going to have 2 kids and I'm going to, you know, have a corporate job and pay tax and, you know, live in Paddington and drink champagne and that kind of thing. But like, and they're trying to kind of like push, you know, separate themselves from like the kind of rabble of sex work. But for me, it's really important to remember that the two communities are so intertwined. And if you know, like the Opera House is a arts institution that really openly supports queer people. And I think if they openly support queer people, you need to recognise that supporting queer rights is supporting sex worker rights. Yeah.
Jules, I want to talk about oppression, and I want to know, you know, in your 20 years of experience, why does feminism have such a problem with sex work?
That's a big question.
Yeah.
Look, you know, I think it comes from, a lot of the times what I found that it does come from misconceptions. And sometimes, you know, I've been speaking to people and they often think that they're helping these poor sex workers, particularly poor yellow sex workers or poor brown sex workers, and, you know, that are caught in these really awful, desperate situations and need to be rescued. So I think that sometimes, you know, it comes from a lack of misunderstanding, and it's not from any ill intent so much as complete misinformation, you know, and also very racialised and privileged conceptions of who sex workers are, particularly migrant sex workers. And to be honest, you know, when I first started you know, working at Scarlet Alliance, and I did a study tour around Asia and met with a lot of sex worker activists, and met with spent 3 months in Thailand with the Empower Foundation. And you know, regardless of even being an Asian sex worker, I was born in Korea and I migrated to Australia. Having studied and grown up in Australia, I still had those kind of first world misconceptions myself, you know, like you have those things that Tilly spoke about, like, oh, it's okay because I had choices. Well, you know, these people have choices too. These are the choices that they make. And in fact, in a lot of ways, their activism was far more advanced and, you know, extreme than ours was. You know, they've got their own sex work venues where it's cooperatively owned by sex workers, and they have sick pay and holiday leave, and it's called the Can Do Bar in Chiang Mai. They've got, like, you know, sex worker centres everywhere, and yet we don't hear about these kinds of things. When we hear about Thai sex workers, it's about these poor trafficked sex workers that are, you know, trapped and, you know, need to be rescued. And the conception of rescue usually has nothing to do with what people really need. If people are actually being exploited, and let me give you an example, like in the case of, like, say, 7-Eleven or Domino's that was in the media and really high profile, exploitation was taking place, but immediately people were like, okay, so let's get these people the wages that they weren't paid. But when it's a sex work scenario, it doesn't come down to, you know, let's get these lost wages for these sex workers. It's like, how do we rescue these poor yellow women from their job? And it's like, no, actually, we want our lost wages. We don't need to be rescued from sex work. Sure. Sex work's not the issue. We just had an asshole employer, and we actually need to get redress for the workplace exploitation, just like other workers. But in fact, when you know, these rescue operations happen that actually pull women from their livelihood and deport them, actually still holding the debt and with reduced opportunity to pay them back, it doesn't improve their lives in any way. It doesn't help them or support them in any way. Yet it's kind of conceived as a form of rescue. And I think that's fundamentally a massive problem that people need to understand, that actually if you want to support us and if you want to support workers, including workers who are experiencing exploitation, then we need to decriminalise sex work.
We will talk about decriminalising in a sec. The idea of choice is really interesting to me because it reminds me of a conversation about women who choose not to have children. And the dialogue is, but what if you change your mind and you're allowed to have this choice so long as you eventually choose to have children? Right. You know, how dare you choose not to have children? And I think it's really the same. People are like, women should have the choice so long as they eventually choose not to do sex work. Right. Tilly, a lot of people assume that sex work is only what people do when they don't have a choice, and that they're merely doing it until their circumstances change. So when you show pride in your work, enjoyment, humour around it, how does that disrupt and how is it received?
Well, I think as sex workers, we're kind of shoved into this corner of only being able to speak about our work in a certain way. You know what I mean? Like we can speak about it as we are now in kind of like a pragmatic view of like speaking about the rights, and that's obviously incredible. But when we speak about having a bad day, we have to be careful with that because our words can be used and weaponized against us by anti-sex work people. One of the things that's really important for me in speaking about my work is speaking about it as a varied thing that's often very absurd. you know, like you're being put into really intimate scenarios with people that you haven't met before, and you're having to read unconscious cues, and it's basically every single moment of sex work is like really intense improv classes, you know? Like you're having to work out what this person wants and what you're going to do in response, and respond in a way that sets your boundaries but doesn't aggravate them, and it creates some scenarios that can be very stressful, but also scenarios that are hilarious. And like for me, like I like to speak about those funny things because I also think we should be able to speak about sex work beyond the binary of you know, exploited or empowered or whatever. And I think also sex workers should be allowed space beyond. So I think, for example, people who are like marginalised, we're often othered, and we're only allowed to speak about ourselves in kind of very, very minimal ways. So, you know, like if you're a trans woman, if you're a sex worker, if you're a injecting drug user, you're allowed to write, for example, a memoir that's a bit salacious, but you aren't allowed to write a dark comedy. Because that would really challenge people, you know? And also that would be like, how are you finding something funny in your work when your work can be a little bit traumatic, you know? But like for me, I feel like often as, I know that marginalised people, like we often find solidarity and get over difficult things by seeing the humour in the situations. So that's a really important thing to me, is to be able to create art and work around sex work that is allowed to be more varied and allowed to step outside that just like salacious like non-fiction element or purely like rights-focused things. But in terms of like the choice aspects, like that's something that interests me too, because like, you know, when I entered sex work, I really didn't really have many other options. Like I was like, you know, didn't have family financial support. Well, my family wasn't even in an ability to like help me in any way. And so I entered it out of financial need. But as I've stayed in it, I have, you know, I've been in it for 8 years now, and I could have left at many points now. Like I have had other opportunities. And so for something that was at the beginning, you know, like, sure, you could say I was coerced by capitalism to do it, because that's like a phrase that people like to use, has become something that, you know, I've stayed in because, to be honest, like every single work day is different, and I never come home not having a funny story to tell to someone.
I can't wait to read your book. It sounds amazing. And just on that idea of a book and a narrative, the injecting drug user, having read lots of those books, they often have to end with them coming clean, them quitting their bad habit, and that's how they get to write that book and tell that story. Chantel.
Yes.
You've been in you started working in the sex industry decades ago. What's changed since your early days?
For me, and for many of my other sisters who I worked with on the street, look, I came into the industry in 1986, so decrim was nowhere to be seen. We were working in a criminalised state, so what was happening there was that we just, you know, we didn't have rights. So sex workers didn't have rights back then, and we didn't have rights in the way where if something happened to us on the street, we couldn't report it, and if something happened with a client, we couldn't report it, and the clients knew it. And the clients bloody knew it. So we had to come together, all sex workers had to come together on the street to protect ourselves. Now, in 1995, we had decrim, and that was brought around because of the Wood Royal Commission into the New South Wales police corruption. And the corruption was unbelievable back in the day. You know, we had brown paper bags with money hidden, tucked away and given to parlour owners so that they wouldn't get raided. And then we had trans workers that were pulled over, chucked into the paddy wagons, and our money was taken off us, and we'd be driven right out to Blacktown and dropped off in the hope that we would get bashed and left there to find our own way back into the city. So all of that stuff happened back then in a criminalised state. And then in 1995, we had the Wood Royal Commission, and then we had decrim come around. And for the trans workers anyway on the street, because we were so used to hearing the police go past on their paddy wagons right past us and say, "Evening, boys," and what we would do to our comeback was evening girls. And so it kind of like, and what could you do? I mean, there was nothing we could do about it, you know. We couldn't report to them who were doing that to us. So it changed. There was a commander from King's Cross who actually came down, and he'd come down every Thursday nights and stand there and be there with us, introducing himself, which we found really, really strange, that this guy is standing there with all these bloody buttons on his shoulder. We knew he was important, but we were just thinking, what the fuck? You know? You know, I mean, you guys are coming down there throwing shit at us. Now we've got the big brass down here. So, but he made a big change for sex workers down there. He changed the way that his officers treated us. A couple of officers got caught actually calling us saying evening boys to us. They didn't see their commander standing tucked away behind us because he was talking to some workers. And as they drove past, they yelled out, "Evening boys," and we yelled back, "Evening girls." And then the commander stepped out of the shadows and went, "Stop." Reverse back. And he made them apologise to us and address us in the way that we should be addressed. Evening, ladies.
So if one person can make a difference, the idea of making sex work criminalised seems to give impunity to abusers because they're keeping everybody undercover, but most of all sex workers. Were there a lot of conversations about the Christian Porter rape allegations among your co-workers?
Which one of us are you addressing, or any of us?
Tilly, would you like to?
I mean, I actually haven't been at work in the last week because I was sick and then had thrush. So I don't know if my co-workers are speaking about it, but to be honest, most of the women I work with are South American migrants, and we don't generally talk politics in the room. Like, we're generally often talking about their children back home, and sometimes I'm helping with them with their English. Like, when I have worked in brothels where it's mainly like white Australian girls, like, we do talk politics, but the place I'm at now, I feel like we're generally just trying to have like a fun time and a giggle and escape from the, you know, the outside world. Yeah.
Jules, is this the sort of thing that sticks in your mind?
Well, look, you know, the example that Chantal gave about the experiences of sex workers, what people need to understand is that that's happening around Australia because sex work, to a large degree, is criminalised, and sex workers are targeted by the police. And this is still going on in Australia. And I think people sort of seem to think that, oh, well, for the most part, it's, not illegal in Australia. And that's actually not the case. So there are actually active campaigns challenging criminalisation of sex work and the targeting by police, including in jurisdictions like Queensland and Victoria, where sex work is licensed. So that means it's actually still regulated by the police. And essentially what this means is that the majority of sex workers can't comply with the onerous conditions of licensing. Also, by law, police are exempt from prosecution and will pose undercover as clients or sex workers in order to entrap sex workers and arrest us. And this still goes on daily, and these abuses are being enacted against sex workers. It's still, if, for example, in WA, a sex worker doesn't have the right to remain silent. You can be strip searched on suspicion of being a sex worker just because, somebody thinks that you might be a sex worker or you've been arrested before. You're standing on the wrong corner and you've got condoms in your bag. That's enough for you to be dragged down to the police station and strip searched. And this is just because you're a sex worker. And, these violations are happening against sex workers every day, let alone when we're a victim of crime. There have been too many cases where sex workers, when they've tried to report sexual assault, and sex work is work and sexual assault is rape, right? Sexual assault is sexual assault, and it is possible for a sex worker to be sexually assaulted. And when we try and report those crimes, particularly in jurisdictions where we're still criminalised. In fact, sometimes we can get arrested just for trying to report a crime against us. Or not believed, like, what did you expect? You're a sex worker, it's part of your job. And it's not. And, you know, I think there's kind of small examples of how sex worker organisations have built those bridges to kind of work with police. It's like a never-ending job, though. So, you know, it's a bit of potluck in terms of what police station you walk into, which police officer you talk to. So, you know, it makes it very, very difficult to seek redress. Even somewhere like New South Wales, where sex work is decriminalised, because those misconceptions and stigma and discrimination still run so deep, and you know, and unfortunately, very deep within the justice system.
And
Jules,
I think also too that decrim did a lot of good for sex workers, but it didn't do any good for discrimination and stigma, you know, so...
Yeah, unfortunately, sex workers still aren't covered by anti-discrimination protections in New South Wales. So that's still a massive gap. There is a bill before Parliament at the moment, and hopefully we will see that gap being bridged so that sex workers are able to seek redress for discrimination and vilification.
Tilly, how does stigma and oppression play out in a sort of day-to-day life?
Oh, I mean, there's sort of like logistical things of like, you know, like sex workers can't donate blood, like sex workers can't enter the United States. Like the United States actually has one of the strictest rules against prostitutes entering in the world. Like they don't allow you to enter if you've done prostitution anytime in the last 10 years, like regardless of whether you're wanting to work there or not. Obviously it plays out against, you know, like as Jules said, the legal system's pretty rigged against sex workers. Like I've had friends lose custody of children because they've been a sex worker, you know, getting a rental, also transitioning, if you do want to leave sex work, transitioning into other work, like your our work isn't seen as legitimate work, so it's really hard to, you know, have our references from like a brothel manager like seen as something that, even though I'm pretty much a diplomat, like some of the things I've done, but other people don't see it that way. Yeah, so it comes lots of things like that, but then it also happens in more personal things. You know, it can be very hard to date as a sex worker, and I find I have sometimes settled for relationships, and I know other sex workers who have that particularly healthy relationships because you're just grateful to get anyone who will date you, because you're not seen as desirable in that kind of way, like not someone who wants to be brought home to parents, or maybe not someone, you know, maybe you're good enough to mess around with but not good enough to have children with, or like whatever. So it comes, you know, the stigma is something that you come up against every single day. And as Chantel was saying, like, it's not something, unfortunately, that legislation changes. Like, I think something like stigma is like much more cultural and deeply ingrained, and unfortunately can't be changed like that, like laws can. It often has to be changed generationally. So I think we will see the effect of the work we're doing now in our children's children, you know? And it's like, so it's a very long game. Yeah.
Can you see any change within like the work that you do, Tilly, like with...
Oh, yeah, no, totally. I see a difference from when I started 8 years ago. Like when I started, like none of my friends knew what I was doing. I was like deeply ashamed of it. Now, like there's like, I can mention that I'm a sex worker to people and they're like, oh, cool. You know, like they're like completely unfazed. But I mean, I will say that's in Australia. And also that's in Australia amongst left-wing people in a pretty like fairly like queer sort of like feminist bubble. When I have travelled overseas, if I say what I do, people have really, really confronted. I think Australia has like quite a unique culture, both because of the laws in some of our states and also which has allowed sex workers to be more visible than in other countries, and that has like fostered a dialogue and a culture that is far more welcoming of sex workers than a lot of other places are. Yeah.
Chantel, does that reflect your experience? Did you have friends outside of sex work that you could be frank with about what you did for a living?
Not really, but not that I gave a damn.
Yeah.
I mean, I think as a sex worker, I think I was just out there and proud of it. So if my friends couldn't handle it, well, they weren't meant to be with me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Jules, culturally, is this something that you could say, for instance, raise with your family?
Yeah, eventually I did. It's disclosure. There's real reasons as to why people might choose not to disclose their work, and actually really think about that. And of course, because of the stigma and discrimination. But, I did. The sky didn't fall down. It's a very core part of who I am. It still is. I have a partner that I've been with for a very, very long time. And, I think many sex workers do have relationships, believe it or not, and have healthy relationships. And it doesn't mean just because we are sex workers that we're incapable of doing that. I just wanted to say as well, though, I think... despite law reform not actually changing those perceptions, it is integral to improving conditions. And as, Chantel spoke about, when sex work did become decriminalised, successive government reviews and the experiences of sex workers in New South Wales have shown that it improved our access to work health and safety. It improved our ability to, report crimes. If we didn't like our workplaces, we could go and work somewhere else. It does make a difference, but it does require also there's still issues because we don't have a standard model of decriminalisation around Australia. It's only in 2 states at the moment, and so it's still very patchy, and the stigma and discrimination needs to be constantly challenged. And that means it needs to be constantly challenged by all of us, not just sex workers, by calling it out as unacceptable when you hear it, not just kind of casually making it another whorephobic comment as a joke, as a butt of a joke. It requires everyone to kind of realise that it's unacceptable and to call it out when they hear it.
We've got some questions here, and if you'd like to ask a question, we're using Slido, sli.do. Just Google that on whatever browser you use. The event code is all about women, and the theatre we're in is the drama theatre. These are probably 2 questions directed at you, Jules. How can we find the balance between accepting sex work and acknowledging that some women are forced or coerced into a position of working in the industry? And from Rachel, I'm a social worker and sometimes suspect my client is being exploited. How do I do this without perpetuating the idea that all sex workers are exploited?
Yeah, no, they're great questions. And certainly it's not a mutually exclusive proposition. Like all jobs, there are good workplaces and bad workplaces, good and bad bosses, and there are people that do experience exploitation. And this is why we say it's so important to have these enabling legal frameworks so that, that sex workers can report crimes against us, can seek retribution for bad workplace conditions. And I think that it's this kind of thinking that people have. It's like if somebody's being exploited in a sex work scenario, not actually looking at that scenario and saying, what does this person need? What are the support needs of this person? What is it that they're actually going through? Instead of, oh my God, all sex work is bad and everyone must get out of sex work and we need to rescue all sex workers. It's a massive leap between this crime that's been committed here and this perception that all of sex work is problematic. So I think, my advice is listen to your client, ask them what they need. Don't make an assumption because they're a sex worker and they're having a bad day or, that they're experiencing something. Actually ask them if you're worried. Actually ask them what's going on. Ask them if they need support. People know, I think they are actually best placed to tell you what they need. And also, if you, I would encourage you to reach out to your local sex worker organisation as well. There's a a list of all the state and territory member organisations of Scarlet Alliance, amazing peer sex worker organisations in each state and territory that are able to kind of work with you and, actually help probably do some in-services with your organisation as well to build those bridges and connections and to help increase the understanding of sex work.
I'm going to direct this question to Tilly, but I have a feeling you've all got something to say on the idea. So from Juno Mack's TED Talk, she mentioned how the sex industry is a site of deeply entrenched social inequality. Most buyers of sex are men with money and most sellers are women without. Which brings me to a comment by Anonymous on Slido who said, sex workers are experts in negotiating consent with our diverse client population. When will we be acknowledged as being at the forefront of consent education?
Oh, love that.
Great question.
And I did notice, Tilly, you mentioned your boundaries and reinforcing them. What have you got that we can learn from about consent and boundaries?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things about that sex work teaches you about consent is what I was talking about earlier, is about unconscious cues. Like, I feel like one of the focuses that we talk about so much in the media is about verbal consent, and the reality is, unfortunately, consent isn't actually, and this is going to sound awful to say because I know black and white is thrown around about rape allegations, but I'm not speaking about rape allegations. I'm speaking about the fact that consent isn't something static. It's like fluctuating. It's always fluctuating. It's like you can feel like doing something in one moment and then in the next moment you don't feel like doing it. And it's also something that we can give out not just through our words, but through the way our bodies move. And I think I would love if the education around consent took it, because also not everyone is verbal. Do you know what I mean? Like, I see disabled clients who are non-verbal and have to, communicate with them in other ways. And like, they've come into the brothel, so like I know they've come in choosing to see me, but I'm still having to engage in an intimate sexual service with them without the added benefit of like language, which is what I usually rely on, So I think, sex workers are really, really well versed in picking up on unconscious behavioural cues that people give, and also in recognising that consent is something that continues throughout an encounter, and it's like it really is a sort of like a malleable thing. And like, consent to me is not this thing that you can like sign a thing for and then have. Consent is more like conversation. It's something that moves between you and is always kind of shifting. And I wish that conversations and like education around consent recognise that, like how nuanced it is. And I also wish that conversations around consent taught you how to say no to things, but also de-escalate through saying no. Because sometimes people do take offence when you say no. And I think sex workers are, as I said, I feel like I'm kind of like a diplomat sometimes, because you learn to be very tactful and not upset people's ego. And like, the reality is, people's ego shouldn't be upset by being rejected, but a lot of people's ego is upset by being rejected. So like, how can we manage it in a way that people don't arc up at you when you set a boundary? And I think those kind of like, sort of like tactful like things are something that sex workers are just so on top of. I
love that all so much. Thank you, Tilly. Chantel, in your experience, is it the same? Like, you have to be a diplomat?
Yeah, pretty much so. Pretty much so. And it's something also too that it's a work in progress, okay? Because I know definitely when I started in the sex industry, it was kind of like hard to navigate what I would let the client do or not. And I made a few mistakes, but it didn't take me long to work out that, hey, I'm the one in control here, right? And I had to work out a way of doing that in the same, in a way where I wouldn't lose the client, or where I wouldn't have the client turn on me. So I found it really easy to be humorous about it. And just say, look, when a client would say, oh, I want to do this, and I want to do this, and I want to do this, and I go, oh, darling, you don't have enough money to do that. And he'll go, what do you mean? I'm paying you for it. And I'll go, yes, but you want me, you're paying me this amount of money to go around the world. That's only going to get you just out of Sydney. You know? Humour works.
I can see how you use humour in those situations. Very disarming. The reason I mentioned about the Juno Mac quote about the inequality, buyers of sex are men with money, sellers of sex are mostly women without, is because of that power imbalance that really affects consent sometimes. So to all three of you here on the panel, when you're fortifying, defending, sticking up for your boundaries, what is your greatest weapon?
Look, I think in a lot of ways, sex workers negotiate consent far more explicitly than people ordinarily do in sexual encounters. So we're very skilled at negotiating our boundaries, negotiating our services, negotiating the price for those services. You know, like the services that we provide are heavily negotiated. And so we're very adept at talking about sex and negotiating and talking about consent and actually kind of, and I think people could learn a lot from that. So I really love that question that came up about sex workers being consent educators, because we really are. I think that there is a lot to be learnt from sex workers in talking about sexuality and consent more openly.
I think also what Chantel said about disarming through humour is really valid, and I know I often deflect so it doesn't feel like it's rejection. Like if a guy is pushing for something that I don't want to do at that time, I've learned if I say, no, I don't do that, or I don't offer it as a service, they still push for it. But if I say, oh, I actually have a partner outside and I save it for them, they go, oh, okay, I get that. Because they would like their girlfriend to save something for them. So I'm like, you know, then it doesn't look like I've rejected them. So like, yeah.
How have mainstream online content sites and subscription services, I guess they're talking about OnlyFans and stuff like that, impacted full service sex work?
Look, you know, I mean, technology has always been a part of sex work. That is, and sex work is, I think, when people think about sex work and sex workers, they have a very narrow conception of what that means. And actually, in fact, it's really diverse. We're not just women doing full service. It's actually a broad array of services, and some of it is actually contact services, and some of it is online and non-contact. We are so diverse in terms of, in every aspect, you know, in the services that we provide, in our sex and gender, and in our racial diversity. So in just like any other profession, we are incredibly diverse, and that is the beauty of sex work. We do set our own boundaries about the services that we do provide, and we can do that. And I think that's a flexibility that not many jobs do have.
I think there is a paranoia amongst some people that online work is taking away from in-person work, but that isn't just about like online sex work. I remember the same, you know, like working at brothels when Tinder first came out. Everyone was like, it's quiet because everyone just gets free sex on Tinder now, and it's like kind of like setting up like the online world as like sapping like, you know, the real world. But like, to be honest, like I don't see them as like that in competition, because like for me, a client who wants to come in and pay for like actual physical touch, if that's what they want, they're going to choose that. Like, you know, OnlyFans is no actual replacement for that. Like for me, as a full service sex worker, I see OnlyFans way more aligned with porn than with the kind of work I do. And I mean, one of the things I do want to say about OnlyFans, because I feel like so many people don't realise this, is like, you know, OnlyFans obviously is, you know, has sex workers working on it, but OnlyFans as a platform is anti-sex work, so anti-full service sex work. So if they find out that you sell in-person sex work, like not even on the platform, just in your life outside of OnlyFans, they will delete your account. So it's not really the kind of like sex worker friendly place that you think it is. It's sex worker friendly for online sex workers, not for full service sex workers. Yeah.
So it's more dangerous.
No, it's not that it's more dangerous. It's just that your account can be deleted at any point and you have your earnings taken off you. So it's like you're kind of constantly like precarious on it, and your earnings can be confiscated.
A question from our audience. As people who are not part of the industry but who do want to be part of supporting sex workers, what are some practical things we can do to help? Can I start with you, Chantel?
Yeah, I think to support sex workers, I think it would be really, really, really good. Like, I love the term "nothing about us without us," you know, and kind of like doing your research and finding out so much more about that. Look, I've been told Google's my friend. I keep saying to my manager, I mean, I want to know about this. She goes, Chantel, Google's your friend. You know? But yeah, it is, you know. Research, do stuff of, you know, research, sex workers, and also to, if you're an organisation and you want to work with sex workers, I mean, nothing about us without us. So if you're going to put out material and resources, make sure you include sex worker voices, you know.
Jules, have you got some thoughts about how to be a better ally?
Yeah, I think listen to the voices of sex workers is really important. Also, you know, there's active law reform campaigns happening all around Australia to support positive law reform that's led by sex workers. I think sometimes, as we spoke about, there can be these laws that are supposedly for our own good but have not bothered to actually listen to sex workers or to consult sex workers, and in fact are quite harmful in reality. So it's really important that those law reform campaigns actually involve sex workers and are led by sex workers. We saw a really great positive example of that when sex work was decriminalised in NT last year, which was, amazing. But sadly, only the third place in the world to do so. And actually the first place where it actually legitimately did so, because in New Zealand, migrant sex workers are still criminalised, and in New South Wales, street-based sex workers are largely criminalised, except in certain areas. So, you know, there's still a lot of work to be done. So I think it's really to support sex workers, but also, as we said before, you know, when you read these things in the media, it actually feeds into these deeply held stereotypes that we have, and deeply held kind of racist and sexist and slut-shaming stereotypes that we all hold to some degree. So it's really important to unpack that and challenge it and to think about what's behind that. I mean, there's been so many cases where we've supported sex workers, like, let's say there's been two Asian sex workers that have been working together, but it's actually illegal to work together. And then you see it in the newspaper and it's like, brothel madam busted for prostitution ring, you know, and actually it was just two sex workers sharing a premises. But so often these things get blown out of proportion and you don't really hear the real story. So I think to kind of really question it and, listen to sex workers, support sex workers. Like being at an event like this today.
Yeah. Tilly, have you got something to add to that idea about how to be better allies to sex workers?
No, I think like a lot of what Jules was saying, like the practical things with like helping with campaigns and stuff, and then I think just like the everyday things of like calling out a friend if they say something really awful about sex workers. But nothing more.
The law that Jules was talking about is from the Northern Territory, and it's a leading kind of piece of legislation that the rest of the world is kind of using as a model. Right. Very progressive sex work legislation. Okay, I love this question. It is going to all three of you, if you maybe take turns to answer. From Anonymous, what has been your favourite moment in your career?
Oh my God.
Wow. Wow. When sex work got decriminalised in NT last year. That was pretty good.
I have three kind of like little things that come to mind. One of my favourite moments in my career was when I got booked by a pregnant woman because she'd never had sex with a woman before and she wanted to try it because like being pregnant made her horny, and like that was just, she was 7 months pregnant, and it was so hot, and it was also so special to be like paid for that, and I felt like I was just let into such an intimate like part of her life. Another really special moment was when I had a client who I'd been seeing for like 5 years after his divorce, and he broke up with me in like, he was like, I can't see you anymore. And the reason was because he'd started dating this Taiwanese migrant woman who was a sex worker, and he wanted to be like monogamous with her. And he was like to me, I never would have dated her if I hadn't spent these 5 years getting to know you, because like getting to know you and hearing you speak about your girlfriends and the people you're in love with, I was able to recognize that you can do this work and still have a functional and like loving relationship. And so he's like, that has allowed me to open up to the idea of dating a sex worker and also having her still work while I'm with her. And like they're now like having a baby together, and they have this whole life together. I'm like, wow, I changed 2 people's lives in that interaction. And it's just like, I'm like, wow, she's got the best partner because I trained him up. But like, anyway, so I really loved that. And another just like a funny moment, because like I was speaking about the absurdity of work, I had this client a few weeks back come into the brothel, and he's intellectually disabled client who comes in and sees me like fairly often, and he's really lovely. And I was like riding on top of him, and he goes, "You're so beautiful." And I was like, "Oh, thanks." And then he goes, "You look exactly like Robert De Niro with your mole." Huge compliment. Robert De Niro is really hot. I'm so about that.
Chantal, do you have a memory of your favourite day at work?
Yeah, look, look, as a street-based sex worker almost 30 years ago, and then trying out, transitioning into working in a brothel, and then finally ending up in the private sector, like working as a private worker, I think that was a real pivotal moment for me, because I had worked in those 3 different areas, and then found that working as a private worker, I became like my own boss, and also to the different ways in working in the industry, like as George said before, the diversity, and also to, as a private worker, I was my own boss. I called the shots. I saw who I wanted to when I was ready. And I remember before starting in the private sector, a client I saw, an accountant. I said to him, "Oh, I'm not getting much bloody work." And he goes, "But that's because you're not looking at what you're doing as a business." And I went, "What are you talking about? All I do is suck cock." And he goes, and he spun around and he said, "No, you've got to look at it as your business." And I thought, wow, I never thought about that. And this accountant client of mine sat there and talked me through how I could make myself a better whore. I love that. Love it. He said to me, "You have to see yourself, what you do as a business, and you have to see yourself as a product." And I went, "What, like a can of spray?" And he goes, yeah. And so you kind of like have to find a way, okay, of selling that product. And you know what? That was the pivotal moment for me.
Wow.
Yeah.
And that's amazing. Can anyone on the panel, this is a question from Anonymous, can anyone on the panel speak about the intersection of disability and sex work? You've alluded to this a couple of times, Tilly.
Yeah, I feel like it's probably not really my place to speak about, because like I don't have a disability. I do have like a number of friends with disabilities who do sex work, and I think I think there's a lot of crossover between people with disabilities and people who do sex work, because often sex work allows you more flexible hours and things that you can do if you have like a chronic illness or severe mental health problems. I think also one of the other things about disabled clients is often disabled clients are weaponized as like kind of this tool to be like, you have to support sex work because like, oh, but what about, people with disabilities who can't have any other way to have sex? Like, of course you must be okay with them, seeing a sex worker. And I find that like a little bit of a problematic way to speak, because firstly it assumes that people with disabilities don't have sex outside of paid sex. And I also think if you're only accepting sex work under the thing of like of seeing clients as like pitiful. Do you know what I mean? Then you're not really accepting sex work, you know? But I feel like in general there are a number of sex workers with disabilities who speak about that intersection who'd be, you know, better placed to speak about it than me. Did you guys want to say anything?
No, I mean, I think that there is, it is important, though. There are some great organisations that are working with sex workers and people with disabilities, such as Touching Base, and connecting sex workers and training service providers as well. So if people are interested in finding out more, there's also a great film called Scarlet, which is a sex worker, Rachel Watton, who specialises in seeing clients with disabilities. And I'd really highly recommend you watch it if you haven't seen it already.
Speaking of films, how much does Pretty Woman have to apologise? Just sort of setting that narrative of the woman who's to be rescued.
I mean, I still love it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I love Julia Roberts, but the reality is there's no way she'd be a street-based sex worker. Someone would have scouted her for modelling. Like, she's so hot. That's the first wrong premise with the film. Like,
I mean, that's just Hollywood, right?
Yeah, no, that's totally Hollywood.
Probably.
I've never watched it.
Oh,
really?
No.
Good for you.
What are the internalised misconceptions you've had to overcome about sex workers yourselves?
Look, you know, I think, like, you know, I was talking about those deeply held archetypes and stereotypes and that we have, you know, and whorephobia is one of them, because from day dot we've fed this kind of, you know, stereotypes and misconceptions about sex work and who sex workers are, and it's either highly pathologised and victimised or highly glamorised, and in fact it's work. You know, and and you know, I think that kind of, it does take a lot of unpacking to realise that we are actually complex, whole human beings with other identities and other lives, and we're not just, you know, like the hooker in the dumpster, as you see on TV, or the pretty woman stereotype. We are actually whole human beings.
I think something that I had internalised that took me a while was I thought there was something wrong with orgasming with a client, because I thought that my work was unreal and performance-based, and if it crossed over into the remotely real, it took away from the real sex I was having in my private life. So I used to feel like a lot of weird shame and discomfort if I came with a client, and like the reality is like sometimes your body just actually orgasms against your will, and I often find the clients I'm most revolted by I orgasm with the easiest, which is like so annoying, but like, so that's like taken me like a long time to reconcile, to be like, oh, I can sometimes enjoy it with someone who I actually hate and find really festive, and that's like okay. Like, yeah.
So, were you ever tempted to fake not orgasming?
I would orgasm, and then I wouldn't be like, oh, that was really good. I would orgasm, and then I'd kind of like get in the shower and be like, you know, I wouldn't want them to know that it was real. I was like, oh no, like, why have I given you that satisfaction of actually having me orgasm?
It's okay to enjoy your job, Tilly.
Yeah, no, I mean, that was what I had to unravel.
Chantal?
Internalised. Yeah, I guess when I first started working, I used to internalise the shame that was put on me by, you know, the public as being a sex worker, or if I was, you know, arrested, you know, when police would say, oh, well, look at you, you deserved it, you know, look at the job you chose, you know. And it took me a while to get over that, but when I got over it,
On that note, we're going to wrap it up. A big thank you to our panel for joining us today. A huge thank you to Gala Vanting, a Melbourne-based activist who put together this panel and did a great job, to the All About Women Festival for having and hosting this panel, and to our audience who I think have taken something and are going to go home changed people from hearing all this amazing stuff. Please thank one more time Jules Kim. you.